My daughter-in-law called me at exactly 6:47 that morning. "We won't be spending Christmas with you this year," she said. "We want something quieter, just the two of us." "That's fine," I replied. She paused, waiting for me to argue, beg, or ask why. Instead, I calmly said, "Do what you need to do. Merry Christmas." Then I hung up. I canceled the catered dinner, the heated tent, the jazz band, the flowers, and every reservation I had already paid for. Finally, I removed their authorized card from my account. That was the moment the desperate phone calls started pouring in. "Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, your city, your country? I'd love to know." Welcome to Silent Sweet Revenge. A note: this story contains fictional elements for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental, but the message is one worth carrying. The call came in at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had just set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter and glanced at the clock above the stove. The same clock Helen picked out at a yard sale in 2009, the one with the little crack along the bottom edge that I never got around to fixing. I had been meaning to fix it for years. I never did. The phone buzzed against the granite, and Brielle's name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer. Something in my gut, that old mechanic's instinct that tells you when an engine sound is off before you even pop the hood, told me this call was not going to be a good one. I picked up anyway. "Raymond?" Her voice came through the speaker, clean and sharp, the way it always did when she had rehearsed something. "I need to let you know we're not spending Christmas with you this year." I set the mug down very carefully so it didn't make a sound. On the dining table sat a stack of folders. Catering confirmation from Henderson's Fine Foods. Rental invoice for the heated outdoor tent, $2,400. Contract for the acoustic jazz trio, $800. Floral arrangement receipt, imported white orchids. Brielle's choice, $1,100. Serving staff for 6 hours. Bakery order for 3 tiered cakes. Every single page had one name printed at the top. Raymond Coulter. Every single deposit had come out of one bank account. Mine. "Raymond, did you hear me?" Brielle said, impatience creeping into her rehearsed calm. "I said we won't be coming this year. Mason and I want something more intimate. Just the two of us." "Fine," I said. That one word landed like a dropped wrench on a concrete floor. "What do you mean, fine?" she said. The rehearsed calm cracked straight down the middle. "I mean fine, Brielle." My voice was steady as a level on a flat surface. "You and Mason do what you need to do. Merry Christmas." I ended the call. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and dialed the catering company. "Henderson's Fine Foods. This is Carla. How can I help you?" "Hi, Carla. My name is Raymond Coulter. I need to cancel my service for December 25th. "Of course, Mr. Coulter. You may forfeit the deposit on a couple of prepared items." "That's fine," I said. And I meant it. In 17 minutes, I dismantled a Christmas celebration built for 30 people. The tent company was apologetic. The jazz trio was disappointed. The florist was surprised but professional. Then I opened my banking app. I found the secondary authorized user card, the one I had added to my account 3 years ago when Mason said he needed it for household emergencies. Under United States federal credit card law, the primary account holder has the right to remove an authorized user at any time without notice, without penalty. I pressed the button. Card removed. I walked to the window. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, soft and quiet, settling on the bare branches of the oak tree Helen had planted the year Mason was born. That tree was 35 years old now, still standing. So was I. I drove to the shop without thinking about it. That was how it had always been for 30 years, whenever something was eating at me. My hands would find the steering wheel, and my truck would find its way to Coulter's Auto, the little garage on Birchwood Avenue that I had built from a 2-bay rental into a real business over the course of 2 decades. I had sold it 4 years ago when my knees started giving me trouble, but the new owner, a decent young man named Travis, had kept the sign above the door. He said it was good for business. I think he just knew it meant something to me. I parked in the side lot and let myself in through the back. Travis had given me a key when he bought the place, told me the coffee was always on, and the corner stool by the tool bench was still mine anytime I needed it. Some mornings I came in just to drink coffee and smell the motor oil and feel like myself again. This was one of those mornings. I had been sitting on the stool for maybe 20 minutes, both hands wrapped around a mug, staring at the hydraulic lift in the center bay, when the back door swung open and Pete Garza walked in, stomping snow off his boots. Pete had been my best friend for 31 years. We had met on a job site in the winter of 1993. I was fixing a fleet of delivery trucks for a warehouse company, and Pete had been hired to do the same thing for half the pay, because the foreman figured a younger guy would work faster. We had both quit that job by Friday and gone into business together the following Monday. Pete eventually branched off to do custom exhaust work, but we had stayed close through 3 decades of engine grease, bad coffee, and the particular kind of friendship that only forms between 2 men who have spent years working shoulder to shoulder without needing to talk much. He took one look at my face and reached for his own mug. "You look like a man who just did something he should have done a long time ago," he said, settling onto the stool beside me. "Brielle called this morning?" I said. "She told me they're not coming for Christmas." Pete wrapped both hands around his mug and let out a slow breath through his nose. And I canceled everything. The catering, the tent, the flowers, the whole thing. I took a sip of coffee. Then I pulled Mason off my account. Pete was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, but the kind where a man is actually thinking before he speaks, which was one of the things I had always respected about him. Then he said, "How much have you been carrying, Ray, total? All of it?" I looked down at the mug in my hands. I had never actually added it up out loud before. There was something about saying numbers out loud that made them real in a way that bank statements never quite did. "The monthly transfer for their lawn service and snow removal," I said. $300 a month. That's been going for 2 years. I paused. "The tires I bought for Brielle's SUV last winter, 4 winter tires, top of the line, $840. The sound system Mason wanted for the car, I paid for half, said it was an early birthday gift. $450. My throat tightened a little, but I kept going. "The Christmas party last year, that was on me too. Different vendors, same story. About 8,000. Year before that, 7,500. Pete set his mug down on the workbench. "Ray," he said, and his voice had gone low and serious in a way that made my chest feel like something heavy was sitting on it. "That's not generosity anymore. That's just you've been paying for your own silence, man. You've been buying your way into a family that should have wanted you there for free." My jaw tightened. My eyes stung, and I hated that I was not a man who cried easily, had not been since Helen passed. But something about hearing it said out loud by another person hit different than thinking it alone in my kitchen at 6 a.m. "I kept thinking it would get better," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "That Mason would figure it out. That Brielle would, I don't know, soften up. See that I wasn't the enemy." "Has she?" Pete asked. I did not answer because we both already knew the answer. My phone buzzed on the workbench between us. I looked down at the screen. A text message from Brielle. No greeting, no punctuation at the beginning, just, Card declined at the wine shop. Must be a bank error. Fix it. Need this for the party. Pete leaned over and read it. His eyebrows went up slowly, the way they did when something confirmed exactly what he had already suspected. She doesn't even know you did it yet, he said. She thinks it's a bank error. She'll figure it out, I said. I turned the phone face down on the workbench. My hand was steady. My heart was hammering behind my ribs, not from fear, not from guilt, but from the particular kind of adrenaline that comes when you make a decision you cannot take back, and you know bone deep that it was the right one. What are you going to do when Mason shows up? Pete asked. Because he will, Ray. You know that. I stood up, carried my mug to the small sink in the corner, and rinsed it out, a habit Helen had drilled into me so thoroughly that I did it without thinking, even in a garage. He will, I said, drying my hands on a shop rag. And I'll be ready. Pete looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and certain, the way a man nods when he believes you. The back door opened again, letting in a cold gust of December air, and Clara stepped through it, unwrapping her scarf with quick, agitated fingers, her cheeks flushed from the cold and from something else entirely. Ray, she said, and her voice was tight in a way that made me set the shop rag down. You need to hear what just happened at Henderson's Fine Foods. Clara Coulter was 64 years old, 5'3", and had never in her life been described as a woman who held things back. She was my older sister by 4 years, and she had driven to Henderson's Fine Foods that morning to pick up a cheese board and some good crackers for her own Christmas gathering. Nothing fancy, just the way Clara liked it. She had been walking past the wine aisle toward the checkout when she heard it. She was standing right there at the register, Clara said, unwrapping her scarf and dropping into the chair across from me, her voice tight with barely contained fury. Brielle, with 2 women from her office, both of them dressed like they were going to a magazine shoot. She had a cart full of things, Ray, Wagyu beef, 3 bottles of imported champagne, truffle something or other. I heard her telling those women she had planned the whole party herself. Pete leaned against the tool bench with his arms crossed, jaw set. Planned it herself, he repeated flatly. With her own money, Clara said, and the way she said it, clipped and precise, made my back teeth press together. That's what she told them, word for word. I've been putting this together for weeks. It's going to be beautiful. Clara shook her head, and I could see her hands trembling slightly in her lap, not from cold, but from anger. Ray, every dollar she's spent on those parties has come out of your pocket. I've watched it for years and never said anything because I didn't want to make trouble. But standing there this morning, listening to her take credit for your money in front of her friends, her voice cracked just slightly. I couldn't breathe. I felt something hot move through my chest. Not rage, something quieter and more solid than rage. The kind of feeling that settles in when you realize the thing you suspected was even worse than you thought. What happened at the register? I asked. Clara pressed her lips together, and then, despite everything, a small, sharp satisfaction crossed her face. The girl ran the card, she said, and it came back declined. Brielle told her to try again. Declined again. Clara leaned forward in her chair, eyes bright. She had to stand there and watch that girl take the Wagyu off the belt and put it back in the bin. The champagne bottles, one by one. Her office friends they looked everywhere except at Brielle. One of them suddenly needed to check her phone very urgently. Pete let out a low whistle. Brielle pulled out some cash, Clara continued. Paid for a small wheel of cheese and a box of crackers. That was all she could cover. Then she walked out of that store with her chin up like nothing happened but Ray. Clara's voice dropped. Her hands were shaking so badly, she nearly dropped her keys at the door. The shop went quiet for a moment. The real kind of quiet. The kind that means everyone in the room is processing something at the same time. Then Pete looked at me and said, "She still thinks it's a bank error." "For now," I said. Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, turning the screen toward me. She had photographed something, a stack of papers she had found tucked inside one of the storage boxes Brielle kept at my house boxes. She had noticed while helping me carry things out to the garage that morning. Receipts, a thick stack of them, catering invoices, floral orders, rental agreements, every single one printed with the same name at the top. Raymond Coulter. She's been telling people for years that she pays for everything herself. Clara said, her voice dropping to something raw and quiet. "And you never said a word, did you? You just let her." My throat tightened until it hurt. "I didn't want to make it harder for Mason," I said. Clara reached across the workbench and put her hand over mine, firm and warm, the way she had done when we were kids and something had gone wrong that neither of us had the words for yet. "I'm sending these to the family group chat," she said. "No caption, just the photos. Let them see for themselves." Before I could answer, the crunch of tires on gravel came from outside, fast, hard. Someone who was not being careful about the ice. Pete straightened up. "That'll be Mason," he said. Mason Coulter was 35 years old and had his mother's eyes, deep brown, quick to show feeling, whether he wanted them to or not. Right now, those eyes were red around the edges, and his jaw was set in the way it got when he was trying to hold something together that was already coming apart at the seams. He came through the back door of the shop without knocking, which he had done his whole life, and for just a fraction of a second, I saw the boy who used to sit on that corner stool and hand me wrenches and ask me why engines made different sounds, depending on what was wrong with them. Then the fraction passed, and he was 35 again, breathing hard, snow melting off the shoulders of his jacket. "Dad." His voice cracked on that one word. "What did you do?" Clara stood up from her chair. I put my hand out toward her just slightly, just enough, and she sat back down. "Good morning, Mason," I said. "Don't—" He pressed his hand against his forehead, fingers digging in. "Brielle is standing in the middle of a wine shop right now with a cart full of things she can't pay for. She called me 3 times in the last 20 minutes. The card is blocked. The catering company called her back to confirm the cancellation. And she's Dad. She is losing her mind right now." "I imagine she is," I said. "You can't do this." His voice climbed tight with desperation. "We have 28 confirmed guests. People made plans. Flights were booked. Mason." I set my coffee mug down on the workbench, and something in the way I did it, slow, deliberate, without any anger, made him stop talking. "Walk with me." I led him through the side door of the shop into the attached garage bay, where Travis kept customer vehicles during the day. Mason's black SUV was parked against the far wall. He had left it there 2 weeks ago when he came by to borrow my extension ladder, and it had been sitting in that spot ever since because neither of us had gotten around to moving it. I pointed to the tires. "Those 4 winter tires," I said. "Do you remember where they came from?" Mason looked at the tires, then back at me. Something shifted behind his eyes. "Dad, $840, I said. "Last January. You called me from the dealership and said Brielle wanted the premium all-weather set, and the budget ones weren't good enough. I drove down and paid for them that afternoon." I walked to the rear of the vehicle and knocked my knuckles against the panel near the trunk. "The sound system. You said it was for long drives. $450 I covered half. Said it was a birthday gift." I turned to face him fully. "My money. My property. And this is my land, Mason. which means under the law I have every right to take back what I paid for while it's sitting on my property. In the United States, personal property purchased by one party remains that party's legal asset, regardless of who is using it, and a property owner has full rights to recover their own belongings from their own land without legal obstruction. I had looked this up the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with Helen's reading glasses because mine were upstairs. Mason's face went the color of old ash. "You're going to take the tires off my car." "Already called someone," I said. As if on cue, Pete appeared in the doorway with a man I recognized, Darnell, who ran a mobile tire service out of a van on Route 9 and had done work for me for 15 years. Darnell gave Mason a brief professional nod and got to work without a word moving, with the efficient quiet of a man who understood this was not his business to be in. "Dad, stop." Mason stepped forward and his voice broke open in a way that made my chest hurt, not enough to change my mind, but enough that I felt it. "Mom is gone. You're the only family I have left. How can you do this?" The words landed where he meant them to, right in the center of my sternum like a key turning in a lock. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I said, "I'm not doing this to you, Mason. I'm doing this because of you. Because somewhere in the last 5 years, you stopped being my son and started being her accountant. And I won't fund that anymore." Mason opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes were glistening now, that deep brown gone glassy with something between anger and something he wasn't ready to name yet. Darnell had the first tire off in under 4 minutes. Mason pulled his phone from his pocket with a hand that was visibly unsteady, fingers fumbling at the screen. I heard it connect, Brielle's voice come through sharp and fast before he even got the phone to his ear. "Don't say another word to him," she said loud enough that Pete and I both heard it clearly across the garage. "Just come home. We have another way." Mason looked at me over the phone. His jaw worked. His eyes were wet at the corners now, one blink away from spilling over. I turned around and walked back inside. Mason was still standing in the garage when I came back out, watching Darnell load the last tire into the service van, with the hollow expression of a man watching something irreversible happen in slow motion. The tow truck he had called was 20 minutes out. He had his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets and his shoulders pulled up around his ears against the cold, and he looked in that moment less like a 35-year-old man and more like a kid who had broken something and didn't know how to tell anyone. I almost said something soft. I almost let the image of him at 8 years old sitting on that corner stool, handing me wrenches, asking 100 questions, pull me back from the edge of what I needed to do. Almost. "Mason," I said, "I need the house key back." He turned from the van slowly, like the words had taken a moment to reach him through water. "What Bajul?" "The key to my house," I said. "The spare I gave you 4 years ago. I need it back." His face crumpled at the edges, not fully, not dramatically, but in the small, painful way that a face does when the person wearing it is trying very hard not to show how much something hurts. "Dad, come on. There's still stuff in your garage that belongs to Brielle. I need to be able to get in and out to—" "Call ahead," I said. "I'll open the door for you, but the key comes back to me today." "You're changing the locks on your own son," he said, and his voice had gone rough and low, scraping against something raw. "Do you hear yourself?" "I'm not changing the locks," I said evenly. "I'm taking back a key I lent you. There's a difference. This is my house, Mason. It has been my house for 31 years. I decide who holds a key to it." He stared at me for a long moment, chest rising and falling in uneven pulls. Then slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his key ring. His fingers worked at the key for a few seconds. It was stuck on the ring, the way keys get when they've been on there long enough to belong, and when it finally came free, he held it out to me without looking up. I took it, slipped it into my shirt pocket. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," he said tightly. "This doesn't feel like something you thank someone for." I went inside, leaving Mason in the cold to wait for his tow truck. Pete had moved to the far side of the shop and was making a considerable show of organizing bolts that did not need organizing, which was his way of giving me room without actually leaving. I sat down at the small desk in the office corner, the same desk where I had signed the original lease on this building 28 years ago, and I pulled out my phone. I scrolled to Snow and Lawn Solutions, the landscaping company I had been paying $300 a month to service Mason and Brielle's property. The contract was in my name. I had set it up 2 years ago when they moved into the new house and said the HOA fees were eating their budget. The woman who answered was named Debbie, and she was apologetic and efficient in equal measure. "Of course, Mr. Coulter," she said. "I do want to confirm the contract is under your name so you have full authority to cancel. Termination is effective within 24 hours of the request." "That's fine, Debbie," I said. "Thank you for your time." I ended the call and set the phone down on the desk. $300 a month. $3,600 a year. 2 years of service. That was $7,200 on top of everything else going toward the upkeep of a house I had never once been made to feel welcome in. I looked up at the wall above the desk where I had hung a photograph years ago, Helen and me, at the shop's grand opening, 1997. She was laughing at something I had said right before the shutter clicked, her head thrown back, one hand on my arm. She had worn a yellow dress that day, even though it was November, and everyone told her she would freeze. Helen never much cared what everyone told her. My throat tightened until it ached. "I think you'd understand this, Helen," I said quietly to the photograph and to nobody and to her wherever she was. "I think you'd tell me I should have done it sooner." Outside, I heard the distant groan of a tow truck coming down Birchwood Avenue. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and walked back to the shop floor. Pete looked up from his bolt organizing project and raised his eyebrows in a question. "Done," I said. He nodded once, slow and certain. My phone buzzed on the desk behind me. I did not go back for it. Whatever Brielle had to say could wait. She had been saying things for 5 years, and I had been listening for too long already. I poured myself the last of the coffee, wrapped both hands around the mug, and stood at the shop window, watching the tow truck hook up to Mason's SUV in the parking lot. Mason stood to the side with his arms crossed over his chest, jaw working, staring at the ground. He was angry. He was humiliated. He was underneath all of it somewhere. I recognized the place where you start to realize that the version of events you have been living with does not quite match the version that has actually been happening. He would get there, or he wouldn't. Either way, it was no longer my job to carry him there on my back. I drove home from the shop in the kind of quiet that only exists in December, the particular stillness of a winter afternoon, when the sky has gone the color of old pewter, and the bare trees stand perfectly motionless against it, as if they too are waiting for something to be over. It was the afternoon of December 23rd, and I had not slept well. The house felt different when I walked in, not emptier than usual, but more honestly empty, if that makes any sense. Like it had stopped pretending to be a house that was waiting for people to fill it up, and had simply decided to be what it was, a house where one man lived quietly, surrounded by 30 years of accumulated life, and that was enough. I made a sandwich, ate it, standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the backyard, and then I did what I always did when I needed to stop thinking so loud. I started cleaning. I worked my way through the downstairs first, wiped the counters, ran the vacuum over the living room rug, straightened the books on the shelf that had been listing to the left for 6 months. Then I climbed the stairs and started on the spare rooms, because Christmas Eve was tomorrow, and the house was going to have people in it, shul people, the kind who came because they wanted to, not because they had been organized into attendance. Mason's old room was the last one on the left. I had not changed it much since he moved out 11 years ago. The twin bed was still against the same wall, the same bookshelf, the same water stain on the ceiling from the leak we fixed in 2016. I had replaced the comforter Helen had done that actually a few years before she got sick. Bought a new navy blue one and made the bed up fresh and said, "So he always has somewhere to come back to." I had never taken it off. Never saw any reason to. I stripped the bed, put on clean sheets, squared the corners the way Helen had taught me. Then I opened the top drawer of the nightstand to check for anything that needed to be cleared out before a guest used the room. There was a phone in there. An old one, Mason's previous model, the one he had upgraded from about 3 years ago. Still plugged into the wall with a short charger cable still holding a charge. I did not even think about it. I just picked it up the way you pick up anything you find in a drawer that shouldn't be there automatically to figure out what to do with it. The screen came on. The battery was at 41%. There were 17 unread notifications from apps that had long since stopped updating, and a string of old text messages that I did not read. But there was also a voicemail notification, a saved message in the inbox, the kind you save because you mean to listen to it again. I should have put the phone back in the drawer. I pressed play. Mason's voice came through the small speaker, low and tired, the voice of a man, talking quietly, so someone nearby wouldn't hear. "Hey, it's me. I know it's late, I just..." A pause. I heard him exhale slowly the way he did when he was wrestling with something. "She's asking me to call Dad again. About money. And I don't want to, man. I hate doing this to him. But if I don't, she's going to make the next 2 weeks absolutely miserable, and I don't have the energy for that fight right now. I don't know how to make her stop. I don't know how to make any of this stop." The message ended. I stood at the side of Mason's bed with the phone in my hand and my chest doing something complicated that I did not have a name for. It was not quite grief, and it was not quite anger. It was something that lived between the two in the place where love and disappointment share a wall. My son had known. He had known it was wrong. He had known every time he made that call, every time he asked me for another check, another favor, another extension of the patience I kept extending because he was my son and I loved him, and I did not know how to stop. He had known, and he had done it anyway, because it was easier than the fight. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment hard and breathed through my nose until the burning passed. I was not going to fall apart in my son's childhood bedroom over a 3-year-old voicemail. I was not built that way. But God, it hurt. "How did we get here, Mason?" I said aloud. To the empty room, to the navy blue comforter Helen had picked out, so he would always have somewhere to come back to. "How did we let it get this far?" I set the phone back on the nightstand, still plugged in. Then I opened the drawer on the other side of the bed, the one that had been Helen's side back when this had been our room, before we moved to the larger one down the hall. There was an envelope in there. Cream-colored, sealed with my name written on the front in Helen's handwriting, the particular slant of it that I would recognize anywhere in any context for the rest of my life. She had given it to me 2 weeks before she passed. "Don't open it until you know it's time," she had said, and she had said it in the tone of voice that meant she was completely serious and also completely at peace, which was the most Helen way to deliver important information that had ever existed. 3 years. I had moved the envelope from drawer to drawer, from the bedroom to the kitchen, to the desk in the office and back again, always knowing it was there, never quite reaching for it. My fingers touched the edge of the envelope. The paper was cool and smooth. From downstairs, I heard a knock at the front door, 3 sharp raps, the kind that meant my sister did not intend to be kept waiting. I slipped the envelope into my shirt pocket next to my heart and went downstairs. Clara came in the way she always did, like the cold air itself had decided to take a human shape and walk through my front door. She had a tin of pecan cookies under one arm, and her coat still buttoned all the way to the top, which meant she had driven straight here without stopping, which meant whatever she had to say had been sitting in her chest the whole drive over and was ready to come out the moment she crossed the threshold. "Sit down," she said, setting the cookie tin on the kitchen table. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without interrupting me." "I'll do my best," I said. I put the kettle on and pulled out 2 mugs, the heavy ceramic ones Helen had bought at a craft fair in 2012. The ones with the uneven handles that she loved specifically because they were imperfect. Clara unwound her scarf, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat down with the particular posture of a woman who has been carrying something heavy and is finally putting it down on a table where it can be examined properly. "You know, I've been going to the family Christmas gatherings for 6 years, she said. "Every year at a different venue, always catered, always a sit-down dinner with a printed menu and place cards, and Brielle telling everyone where to stand for the photographs." She pressed her lips together. "I went because you were there. Ray, I want you to understand that. Every single one of those dinners, the only reason any of us showed up was because of you. Not the food, not the venue. You." My hands tightened around my mug. "She told people things, Ray." Clara continued, and her voice dropped into that register that meant she was choosing her words carefully because the ones that came naturally would be less diplomatic. "About you. To the cousins, to the aunts and uncles, to anyone who would listen when you weren't in the room." She looked me directly in the eye. "She told them you were just the old mechanic, that you didn't quite fit in her world, that she kept inviting you out of obligation because Mason felt guilty." Clara's jaw tightened. "She was ashamed of you. She has been ashamed of you for years, and she made sure the people around her knew it." The kitchen felt very still. Outside, the wind moved through the bare oak in the backyard, and the branches made a low sound against each other, like something sing. My eyes went hot, and I blinked hard twice. I was not going to cry at my kitchen table over Brielle Ashby's opinion of me. I refused. But the burning was there whether I wanted it or not, pressing at the back of my eyes with a persistence that did not care what I refused. "Clara," I started. "I'm not done," she said, not unkindly. "There's one more thing." She had barely finished the sentence when there was a knock at the front door. 3 soft taps, the tentative kind, the kind that belongs to someone who is not entirely sure they should be knocking at all. I opened the door to find Patricia Holloway standing on my porch with a covered pot in both hands and snow collecting on the shoulders of her coat. Patty had lived next door for 20 years. She had brought food to this house when Helen was sick, when Helen passed, when the furnace broke in January 2 years ago, and I spent 3 days waiting for the repair crew. She was 68 years old, moved slowly since her hip replacement, and had the particular quality of a woman who noticed everything and said very little until she had something important to say. "I won't stay," she said immediately, which was what she always said and never meant. "I just made too much soup and thought you might want some." "Come in, Patty," I said. "Clara's here." She came in, put the pot on the stove, and stood with her hands clasped in front of her in a way that told me the soup was not the real reason she had come. "Raymond," she said, "I've been debating whether to tell you something for about 3 months now. And after what I heard happened yesterday," she glanced at Clara, who gave her a small nod, "I think I've waited long enough." "Go ahead," I said. Patty took a breath. "Last September, Brielle came to my door. Just her, no Mason. She said she was in the neighborhood and wanted to introduce herself properly, and we had a cup of coffee on my porch. She paused. And she spent most of it asking me questions about you. About the house, how long you'd owned it, roughly what it might be worth now, whether the deed was in just your name or whether it had ever been joint with Helen's. She asked if I knew whether you had a will drawn up. Patty's voice was steady, but her hands were not. They had tightened against each other, knuckle to knuckle. She was very pleasant about it, very casual. I thought she was just being a caring daughter-in-law, looking out for your future. I didn't think anything of it until... Her voice faltered for just a moment. Until now. Ray, I am so sorry I didn't say something sooner. The room felt like it had shifted slightly on its foundation. I set my mug down on the table very carefully. My mind was moving through what Patty had just told me, the way it moved through a diagnostic systematically, without panic, looking for what the symptom meant about the underlying problem. Brielle had come to my neighbor's house in September to ask about my property value, my deed, my will. That was not a daughter-in-law looking out for someone's future. That was reconnaissance. You have nothing to apologize for, Patty, I said, and I meant it completely. You didn't know. Clara was watching me from across the table, her hands flat on the surface, her expression carrying the kind of careful steadiness that people put on when they are watching someone absorb something difficult and want to be ready to catch them if they need it. I reached into my shirt pocket and drew out the envelope. Helen's handwriting on the front, cream-colored, sealed for 3 years. I placed it on the table between us. 3 years, Clara said quietly. You really haven't opened it. Not yet, I said. My fingers rested on it for a moment, feeling the slight give of the paper, the faint edge of whatever was folded inside. But I think tonight might be the right time. Patty looked at the envelope, then at me, and said nothing, which from Patty was the loudest possible form of agreement. Clara and Patty left just after 8. I stood at the front door and watched their taillights disappear down the street. Then I closed the door, threw the deadbolt, and stood in the front hallway for a moment, with my hand still on the lock. The house was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has texture to it. The low hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the baseboard heater, the wind pushing against the windows in soft, irregular intervals. I went to the kitchen. The envelope was still on the table where I had left it. I sat down, pulled it toward me, and looked at my name in Helen's handwriting for a long time. She had always written her H's with a particular flourish at the top, a small extra loop that nobody had ever taught her, and that I had never seen in anyone else's handwriting in 60 years of living. I used to tease her about it. She used to tell me it was a signature, not a flaw. I reached into the kitchen drawer for the letter opener she had kept there for 30 years, and I opened the envelope. There were 2 pages inside folded together, her handwriting. Blue ink, the same careful loops. I spread them flat on the table and began to read. Ray, if you're reading this, it means you finally decided it was time. Knowing you, that means something happened that made the decision for you, because you would have kept not opening this for another 10 years if left to your own devices. Despite everything, I laughed, a short, involuntary sound that came out before I could stop it. Even on paper from 3 years away, she knew me better than I knew myself. I need to tell you about the account. Gary Odom has the paperwork. He drew it up properly 6 months before I passed, so everything is legal and in order, and he's been holding it for when you needed it. The fund is yours to use however you see fit. But I want to tell you what I hoped for it. If Mason has become the man I raised him to be, give it to him. Not to them. To him. If he hasn't, if he's let someone make you smaller than you are, if he's stood by while you were treated as less than you deserve, then I want you to spend every dollar of it on yourself. Alaska, Portugal, a fishing boat. Whatever makes you feel like Raymond Coulter again instead of someone's silent bank account. My throat closed completely. I pressed my fist against my mouth and breathed through my nose, slow and deliberate, until the tightness passed enough for me to keep reading. The last thing, and this is the most important thing I will ever say to you. You have given too much for too long to people who have confused your generosity for weakness. Your kindness is not weakness. It has never been weakness. But Ray, you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to say enough. You are allowed to take up space in your own life without apologizing for it. I have watched you make yourself smaller for years so other people could feel bigger. I should have said something sooner. That's my one regret. I love you. Go to Alaska. Helen. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. At some point I reached under the table and pulled out the small shoebox where I kept miscellaneous papers, receipts, old cards, things I meant to file and never did. At the very bottom was a small spiral notebook with a green cover, Helen's handwriting on the first page. Household 2019 to 2021. Her record-keeping book, the one she had kept until she was too sick to keep it anymore. I turned to the last page she had written on. In smaller letters than the rest, slightly uneven, the way her handwriting had gotten near the end, when her hands were not always cooperating. Ray has given too much. I hope one day he allows himself to receive. I closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment. Then I tucked it into my shirt pocket, alongside the letter, next to the place where my heart was doing something that hurt. In the best possible way, the way that means something long frozen is finally beginning to move again. I looked up at Helen's photograph on the wall. The yellow dress. The laugh caught mid-sound. Alaska, I said. I think I can do Alaska. Then I picked up my phone and typed a message to Clara. Can I borrow Mom's orange glaze recipe and tell Greg to bring the good bourbon tomorrow? I sent it at 11:47 at night. She replied in under 2 minutes. Already knew you'd ask. See you tomorrow, Ray. I was up at 5 in the morning. Not because I had set an alarm I never set. Alarms had not needed one since the first week of trade school in 1982. When my body decided that 5 o'clock was simply the time the day started, and had never revised that position. I made coffee, drank the first cup standing at the kitchen window, watching the dark backyard go gradually gray with the coming dawn. And then I put on my heavy work coat and my gloves, and I went to the garage. Brielle had been storing things at my house for 2 years. 6 large plastic storage bins stacked against the far wall of my garage. Behind my workbench, seasonal china, she said they didn't have room for Christmas decorations she claimed were too valuable to store in their own basement. A set of silver candelabras she had bought at an estate sale and never used. I had never asked her to move them. I had never said a word about them taking up a third of my garage space. I had simply worked around them the way I had worked around everything else quietly, without complaint, as if accommodating the overflow of her life in my space was just another line item in the budget of keeping the peace. Not anymore. I moved the bins one at a time, dragging them through the garage, down the side path, and out to the front of the house. The temperature was 28 degrees, and my breath came out in thick clouds. The first bin was heavy enough that I had to stop halfway and reset my grip. The second one had a cracked lid that kept threatening to come off. By the 6th one, my lower back was reminding me with considerable feeling that I was 60 years old and had been bending over engine blocks for 3 decades. I did not stop. I stacked all 6 bins on the front walkway, neatly one beside the other, where they would be the first thing anyone saw when they pulled into the driveway. Then I went inside, washed my hands, refilled my coffee, and picked up my phone. The Coulter family group chat had existed for about 4 years. Clara had set it up originally to coordinate Thanksgiving logistics, and it had evolved into the place where the family shared photographs, complained about the weather, and sent each other links to articles that nobody ever read. It was Raymond's side of the family only. Brielle had never been added to it, and to my knowledge she had never asked to be. She had her own world. This was ours. I typed Christmas Eve smoked ribs with orange glaze at my place. Doors open after 7. Clara's bringing the pecan cookies. I sent it and set the phone on the counter. Then I went to the living room and started moving furniture to make room for extra chairs. I had the couch pushed back and was dragging the armchair toward the window when my phone started going off on the kitchen counter, the particular rapid-fire buzzing of a group chat that has suddenly come to life. I left the armchair where it was and went to look. Greg had replied first, about time. I've got a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle I've been saving for the right occasion. Then Clara, already making the potato salad. What time do you need me? Then Greg's daughter, my niece Renee. We'll be there. Should I bring the kids? Then Clara again, bring everybody. Then 3 more cousins in quick succession. Then my nephew Dale, then Greg's son-in-law, who I had met exactly twice but who apparently felt strongly about smoked ribs. Then Renee again with a string of confirmations. In 22 minutes, 11 people had confirmed for Christmas Eve at my house. I stood at the kitchen counter reading their names one by one, and felt something warm move through my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. These people were not coming because they felt obligated. Nobody had organized them. Nobody had sent a formal invitation with a printed menu and a parking plan. I had sent 8 words in a group chat at 5:30 in the morning, and 11 people had said yes before 6 o'clock. I thought about all those catered dinners. All those stiff, formal evenings where people arrived dressed like they were attending a performance and left having successfully endured it. I thought about the year Brielle had assigned seating at Christmas dinner and put my brother Greg at the far end of the table away from me because she said it would flow better. Greg had driven 40 minutes to be at that table. He had spent the whole evening making faces at me from across the room that only I could interpret. I was still smiling at the memory when I heard the familiar sound of tires on my driveway. Not the tow truck this time, but Brielle's SUV moving fast and stopping hard the way she always did when she was furious and trying not to show it. They both got out. Mason had his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground. Brielle had her eyes locked on the 6 bins on the front walkway, and the expression on her face moved through several stages in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, fury, before settling into the particular rigid composure of a woman who has decided that showing her real reaction would cost her something she is not prepared to lose. "Raymond," she said, stopping in front of the bins with her arms crossed. "What is this? Your things," I said pleasantly. "I needed the garage space." "You needed—" She stopped herself visibly. Her jaw was so tight I could see the muscle working at the corner of it. "You could have called and asked us to come get them. You didn't have to just throw them outside like garbage." "They're not thrown," I said. "They're stacked. There's a difference." Mason stepped forward, and his voice was tired in a way that went bone deep. "Dad, please, can we talk about this?" "We can talk," I said, "but the boxes stay outside." I looked at Brielle steadily. "I think you should take them today, before it gets colder." Brielle held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that I could not quite read. Not quite anger anymore. Not quite anything I had a name for. Then she turned to Mason and said in a voice that left no room for discussion, "Start loading." Mason bent down and picked up the first bin without a word, carrying it toward the SUV, with the heavy, deliberate movement of a man doing penance. Brielle did not lift a finger to help him. She stood on my front walkway, with her arms still crossed, watching him work, while the December wind came down the street and moved through her hair and found every gap in her coat. When the last bin went into the back of the SUV, she turned to look at me one more time. She opened her mouth. I went inside and closed the door. I stood in the front hallway and listened to the SUV's engine turn over back out of the driveway and pull away down the street. Then I went back to the kitchen, picked up my phone, and looked at the group chat again. At the very bottom, one new message had appeared while I was outside, a voice memo forwarded into the chat from a number none of us recognized. I pressed play. Before I go any further, type "still here" in the comments so I know you're with me. Because what's about to land in that group chat is something nobody in the Coulter family saw coming. Welcome back to Silent Sweet Revenge. A quick note. This story contains some fictional elements crafted for reflection and depth. If that's not your preference, no hard feelings. This is a good place to step away. The voice memo was 43 seconds long. I know because I checked the timestamp before I pressed play, an old habit from years of logging repair notes. Always mark the time, always know exactly what you are working with before you start. 43 seconds. Sent from a number with a Georgia area code that nobody in the Coulter family recognized. Clara's number had been passed around for holiday coordination 2 years back. Apparently, Brielle's friend had it saved, and when she forwarded the message, she hit the wrong contact. I pressed play. Brielle's voice filled my kitchen, bright and conversational, the way it got when she was talking to someone she considered an equal, which was a noticeably different register from the way she talked to me. I know it's a disaster. He actually did it. Canceled everything, pulled the card, had the tires taken off Mason's car this morning, like some kind of, I don't even know what. Listen, the party is still happening. I found a place that can do a last-minute setup. It's not what I wanted, but it'll work. I just need Mason to stop being useless for 5 minutes and... A brief pause. Oh, don't even get me started on the family. You know what he is? He's just an old grease monkey who never figured out that the world moved on without him. He signs whatever you put in front of him, he always has. And honestly, the whole thing would have been fine if he'd just stayed in his lane like he was supposed to. The message cut off there. 43 seconds. I set the phone down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you are worried you might break if your hands are not completely steady. My hands were not completely steady. The group chat had gone absolutely still. In a chat that had produced 47 messages in the last hour, there was nothing. No replies, no reactions. Just the voice memo sitting there in the thread, like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence spreading outward from it in every direction. I stood at my kitchen counter and breathed. The thing about hearing something like that, hearing your own name attached to that kind of contempt in that casual tone, the tone of someone who says these things so regularly that they no longer feel like they require any particular emphasis, is that it does not hit you all at once. It lands in layers. The first layer is simple comprehension. The second layer is the recognition that this is not new information, that some part of you already knew this was what she thought, that you had been working very hard for a very long time not to look directly at it. The third layer is grief, not for what she said, but for the years you spent being smaller than you needed to be so that someone who thought this of you could feel more comfortable. My eyes were burning again. I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard. Then my phone buzzed. One message from Greg in the group chat Friday nights at Ray's. I'm bringing the good bourbon, and I am never going to one of those catered dinners again as long as I live. I let out a breath that had been sitting in my chest for what felt like several minutes. Then Clara Ray. We love you. See you tonight. Then Renee, Uncle Ray, we've always thought you were the best part of those parties, just so you know. I picked up the phone, read each message twice, and put it back down, My throat was doing something complicated that I was choosing not to examine too closely. The front door knocked 3 sharp raps, Pete's knock, the one he had used since 1993, that I could identify in my sleep. I let him in. He was carrying a paper bag from the grocery store and a flat of ribs from the butcher on Clement Street, and he took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I handed him the phone and let him read the chat. He scrolled up slowly, found the voice memo, pressed play. Stood there in my front hallway, listening to Brielle's voice fill the space between us. When the 43 seconds were done, he handed the phone back without a word and walked past me into the kitchen and started unpacking the ribs onto the counter. "Pete," I said. "I heard it." He said, his back to me, hands moving with the steady efficiency of a man who knows that the best thing he can do right now is be useful. "I've got the dry rub in the bag. You got the smoker preheated?" "Not yet." "Then let's get it going." He turned around, and his eyes were doing something that I had only seen them do a handful of times in 30 years, a particular brightness that meant he was angry on someone else's behalf, and was managing it very carefully. "Ray, you already knew what she thought of you. Now everybody else does too. That's not a loss. That's a door opening." I stood there for a moment, looking at my oldest friend standing in my kitchen at 8 in the morning on Christmas Eve, ready to spend the day making smoked ribs and act like this was just another Tuesday, because that was who Pete Garza was and had always been. The burning behind my eyes intensified. I blinked it back with some effort. "All right," I said. "Let me get the smoker." "Good," Pete said. He reached into the paper bag and pulled out Helen's orange glaze recipe he had stopped by Clara's on the way over, and picked it up without being asked, had written it out on a 3x5 index card in his large blocky handwriting. He set it on the counter next to the ribs. I looked at it for a moment. Helen's recipe, Pete's handwriting. Christmas Eve, the voice memo still sitting in the group chat, where 11 people had now read it, and chosen, without any coordination, to respond with love instead of outrage. "Okay," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, but steadier than I expected. "Let's make some ribs." By 2 in the afternoon, my kitchen smelled like it was supposed to smell on Christmas Eve. Hickory smoke drifting in from the back porch where the smoker had been running since 9. Brown sugar and smoked paprika from the dry rub Pete had mixed in a bowl on the counter, measuring nothing, going entirely by the smell, the way we both had learned to do years ago. Orange zest from Helen's glaze recipe written out in Pete's blocky handwriting on the index card propped against the backsplash. The whole house had taken on a warmth that had nothing to do with the thermostat, and everything to do with the particular alchemy of food being made by people who actually wanted to be somewhere. Pete and I had been working side by side for most of the morning, talking the way men talk, when they have known each other long enough that the conversation doesn't need to be about anything in particular to mean something. The voice memo had not come up again. There was nothing more to say about it that the group chat hadn't already said better. Clara arrived at 2:15 with a container of potato salad, a grocery bag of sides, and the energy of a woman who had been looking forward to this for considerably longer than 24 hours. "Something smells incredible," she said, dropping her coat over a kitchen chair and tying on an apron she pulled from her own bag because Clara always brought her own apron, had done so at every family gathering for 30 years, and I had long ago stopped wondering about it. She moved to the stove, lifted the lid on the pot I had going, and gave it a stir with the confidence of a woman who has been co-cooking in someone else's kitchen her entire adult life. "Where do you want the potato salad?" "Counter's fine," I said. Pete poured her a glass of sweet tea without being asked, set it next to her elbow, and she picked it up without breaking stride. The 3 of us moved around each other in the kitchen, with the easy efficiency of long practice, and for a while the only sounds were the low bubble of the pot, the periodic crackle of the smoker from outside, and the comfortable sound of people being exactly where they want to be. It was Pete who brought it up. He was standing at the counter trimming the last rack of ribs, and he did it the way Pete always started important conversations sideways, looking at what his hands were doing instead of at the person he was talking to. "You remember about 3 Christmases ago," he said, "right around this time of year." "What about it?" I said. "Brielle had that emergency." He kept his eyes on the ribs. "Before she had insurance sorted out. The hospital bill." The kitchen went a particular kind of quiet. Clara set down her wooden spoon. "Ray came to me," Pete said, still not looking up. "Asked if he could borrow $2,000. Said it was for a family situation, didn't go into details. I gave it to him the same day, no questions." He paused, running the knife along the membrane. "He paid me back in 4 months. Every dollar. Never mentioned it again." Now he looked up directly at Clara. "She never knew it was him. Far as Brielle knows, Mason figured it out on his own. Ray asked me not to say anything, said Mason had enough on his plate. It wasn't in the numbers I'd laid out at the shop 2 days ago because I hadn't counted it that way. It wasn't money I'd spent directly. It was money I'd borrowed to spend on her, and at the time that felt like a different thing entirely." Clara was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the one she got when she was trying very hard not to cry in front of people, and was approximately half successful at it. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were bright, and she pressed her lips together for a moment before she trusted herself to speak. "Ray," she said, "you paid her medical bills, and she called you a grease monkey who doesn't know anything." "She didn't know it was me," I said. "That's not the point, and you know it." I turned back to the stove and gave the pot another unnecessary stir. My chest felt full of something I didn't have a precise name for, not self-pity. I had never had much patience for self-pity, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood. The awareness of having given something freely and completely, with no expectation of return, and having it be not just unacknowledged, but actively accompanied by contempt. I had paid for her emergency, and she had spent 3 years being embarrassed by my hands. "Pete asked me not to say anything at the time," I said finally, and the steadiness in my own voice surprised me a little. "And I think I'd make the same choice again. It was the right thing to do. She needed help. That's what you do when someone needs help." I looked over at Pete. "But I'm glad you said it now." Pete nodded once. Clara reached over and put her hand briefly over mine, the same gesture she had made at the shop 2 days ago, firm and warm. Then she picked her spoon back up and went back to the pot, and the kitchen settled into its rhythm again. We were 40 minutes from the first guests arriving when the doorbell rang. Greg. I assumed he had texted 20 minutes ago that he was leaving. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to answer it. And when I opened the door, I found a man I had not seen in 15 years standing on my front porch in a good wool coat with snow on the shoulders, holding a bottle of wine, and looking at me with the particular expression of someone who is very pleased with themselves for having made a good decision. Dorian Whitaker had been 26 years old the last time I saw him, a kid really still figuring out which end of a torque wrench to hold. He was 51 now, broader through the shoulders with gray at his temples, and the settled look of a man who had grown comfortably into himself. He had gone on from our old shop to get an engineering degree on a night school schedule, had worked his way up through 3 different companies, and was now, as I had learned from a mutual friend some years back, the chief executive officer of a mid-sized manufacturing firm in the city. "Ray Coulter," he said, and his voice was exactly the same. "I heard there were smoked ribs." "Dorian Whitaker," I said, and I felt my face do something it had not done all day break into a genuine, uncomplicated grin. "Get in here before you freeze." He stepped inside, shook my hand with both of his, and looked around the hallway with the satisfied expression of a man arriving exactly where he intended to be. "I saw the group chat through Marcus Webb," he said, referring to a mutual friend who had married into the extended Coulter orbit years ago. "I know I wasn't on the list, but I figured smoked ribs on Christmas Eve was worth the risk of showing up uninvited." "You're not uninvited," I said. "You're exactly who I would have called if I'd thought to call you." He handed me the wine, stepped into the kitchen, and stopped when he saw Pete. The two of them looked at each other for half a second, and then Pete said, "You got taller," which was objectively untrue, and both of them knew it, and Dorian laughed the way a man laughs when he is home. Clara materialized with a glass of sweet tea. Greg arrived 7 minutes later with the bourbon. The house began to fill. Dorian settled at this kitchen counter with his tea, watching Pete and me work, and after a few minutes, he said in a conversational tone that was somehow also very careful, "Ray, you know Brielle works for me, right?" I turned around. "I didn't know that," I said. I turned around slowly. Dorian was still leaning against the counter with his tea, his expression carrying that particular careful quality, the kind that means a person has been sitting on something for a while and has finally decided the time is right to put it down. "She applied about 18 months ago," he said. "Entry-level position in the operations coordination department. She used the Coulter name on the application. I didn't connect it to you until about 6 months in when someone mentioned her husband's family." He set his tea down on the counter and looked at me directly. "Ray, she's a trainee. She hasn't finished her probationary period. She's been with us 14 months, and she's still in the entry-level classification." The kitchen had gone quiet around us in that spreading ripple way it does when something important is being said in the middle of an ordinary moment. Pete had stopped moving at the stove. Clara had both hands flat on the counter. "She told the family she'd been promoted," I said. It was not quite a question. "I know," Dorian said. "One of my senior managers mentioned it to me. Apparently she'd been telling people at a holiday function that she was heading up a regional division." He shook his head, and there was no pleasure in it, no satisfaction at delivering this information. He looked like a man doing something he considered necessary rather than something he considered enjoyable. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't know the full picture. "But Ray, the reason she didn't want you at that party." He paused. "She told a colleague that her father-in-law was a retired auto mechanic, and she was worried about how it would look." Those were close to the exact words. My throat tightened. Not with hurt, I had moved past the place where Brielle's opinion of my hands could hurt me, I thought. Somewhere around the 3rd year of watching her use those same hands' earnings to buy things she was ashamed to associate with me. What I felt was something more like the click of a final piece of information settling into a slot that had been waiting for it. She had not excluded me from the party because of a scheduling conflict or a preference for a smaller gathering or any of the half-dozen vague explanations Mason had offered over the phone when I asked. She had excluded me because I was the embarrassment she was trying to hide. The money was fine. The money was welcome. The man the money came from was the problem. "Dorian," I said, "thank you for telling me." "I should have looked closer sooner," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't." Greg's voice boomed from the living room, something about the bourbon being open, and someone named Dale needing to stop hogging the good glasses, and the kitchen came back to life around us the way a room does when it remembers it has other things to be. The next 2 hours were the best 2 hours I had spent in my own house in longer than I could honestly remember. My niece Renee showed up with her husband and their twin boys, who were 7 years old, and immediately disappeared into the backyard to throw snow at each other, despite having been told specifically not to. My nephew Dale arrived with a 6-pack and a fruit pie his wife had made. 3 cousins I saw once a year, and wished I saw more came through the door in quick succession, bringing noise and cold air and the particular warmth of people who are genuinely glad to be somewhere. Greg's son-in-law, a tall, quiet man named Terence, who I had met exactly twice, turned out to be an extraordinarily good bartender, and he set up an informal station on the dining room sideboard with the efficiency of someone who had found his calling. Clara stationed herself at the kitchen island and became the unofficial traffic coordinator of all food-related movement. Pete ran the smoker with the focused serenity of a man in his element, and I moved through my own house feeling something I had almost forgotten was possible. I was not coordinating. I was not managing. I was not calculating the per-head cost of the food, or worrying whether the table linens matched, or watching the clock to make sure the courses came out on schedule. I was simply there talking to my brother over a glass of bourbon, laughing at something Renee said about her boys watching Pete slice the ribs with the practiced precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times. I was not useful. I was present. And it turned out those were two entirely different things. It was Greg's son, Jamie, who found it. Jamie was 24, Greg's youngest, and he had inherited his grandfather's gift for being somewhere quietly and noticing everything. He was sitting at the end of the dining table with his phone, as young people do at family gatherings, when he looked up and said, "Uncle Ray, can I show you something?" He turned the phone toward me. It was an Instagram story posted 40 minutes ago by an account I didn't recognize, one of Brielle's friends, judging by the handle. A photograph of a long dining table, white linens, candles lit the kind of table that had been set with considerable effort and expense. 4 people sitting at it. The rest of the chairs I counted were empty. 14 empty chairs arranged around a table set for 30 in a rented event space that I recognized from the floral arrangement style as the same vendor Brielle had used the year before. 4 people. After everything. Nobody at the dining table laughed. Greg looked at the photo for a long moment and then set his bourbon glass down and said quietly, "4 people, Ray, after all of that." Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. I looked at the photograph for a moment longer. The careful centerpieces, the printed menus at each place setting, the 4 people arranged at one end of a table designed for 30, doing their best to look like this was the plan all along. Then I looked up in the room around me. Renee's boys had come back inside and were being loudly redirected by their father. Terence was pouring. Pete was calling from the kitchen that the ribs were ready. Dale was telling a story that had Greg covering his mouth, trying not to laugh too early and ruin the punchline. 23 people in a house built for 1. I handed the phone back to Jamie. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, tucked the phone away, and reached for the bread basket. The doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone else. I glanced at Greg, who shrugged. I crossed the living room, stepped around Renee's boys, and opened the front door. Brielle stood on my porch with a gift-wrapped box in both hands, and Mason one step behind her, his face carrying the expression of a man who has been talked into something he is not at all sure about. The porch light caught the bow on top of the box gold ribbon, perfectly tied, the kind that takes real effort. Her eyes found mine and then moved past me into the house, scanning quickly until they landed on Dorian Whitaker, standing at the dining room entrance with a glass of sweet tea. Her face did something complicated. "Raymond," she said, and her voice had the careful brightness of someone performing composure. "We brought you something, to apologize. Before I tell you what was inside that gift box, type 'open it' in the comments, and let me know you're still here. Because what Raymond found inside that wrapping paper is something Brielle cannot take back, ever. A reminder, this story contains some fictional elements woven in for emotional impact. If you'd prefer to step away before this next part, the door is open, and we respect that completely." I stepped aside and let them in. That was the thing about being the kind of man I was, even now, Even after everything that had happened in the last 3 days, the instinct to open my door when someone was standing on the other side of it was too deeply wired to override. I stepped aside and Brielle came in first with the gold-ribboned box, and Mason followed one step behind her, his eyes doing a careful survey of the room that told me he was counting people and calculating something. There were a lot of people to count. The living room had gone the particular quality of quiet that happens when a large group of people simultaneously notice something and simultaneously decide not to be the first one to react to it. Renee's boys, who had been arguing over the last dinner roll, went still. Terrence paused with a bourbon bottle in mid-pour. Greg turned from the conversation he had been having with Dale and looked at his sister-in-law with an expression he did not bother to make neutral. Brielle took all of this in with a single sweep of the room. Then she arranged her face into something warm and stepped forward and held the box out to me with both hands, the gold ribbon catching the light from the overhead fixture. "Raymond," she said, and her voice had that particular music to it, the register she used when she was performing sincerity for an audience she considered important. "We wanted to come by and apologize. Mason and I talked it over and we both agreed that things got out of hand and we want to make it right. This is for you." The room was watching. I took the box from her with both hands. It was about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in cream paper, with the gold ribbon tied in a proper bow, the kind that takes real time to get right. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. It was very light. I looked at Brielle. She was looking back at me with an expression of careful expectancy, the slight forward lean of someone waiting for a reaction they have planned for. Behind her, Dorian Whitaker stood at the dining room entrance with his sweet tea, watching with the quiet attention of a man who has spent 20 years in boardrooms learning to read what is happening underneath what is being said. Mason was looking at the floor. "Thank you, Brielle," I said. "Let me open it." I did not take it to the counter or set it aside for later the way you might with a gift you intended to appreciate privately. I stood where I was in the middle of my living room, with 23 people arranged around me in various states of attention, and I undid the gold ribbon carefully, looped it over my wrist, and unwrapped the cream paper with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has spent his life working with his hands and knows that rushing a process rarely improves the outcome. The paper came away. Underneath was a plain white box, the kind that could have come from any department store. I lifted the lid. The box was empty. Not almost empty. Not empty except for tissue paper or a card or a forgotten item. Empty white cardboard interior, four corners, nothing else. The kind of empty that was either a very rushed mistake or something that said more than any gift could have. The living room had gone absolutely still. I looked at the empty box for a moment. Then I looked up at Brielle. Her face had done something I had not seen it do before. The composure had slipped, not completely, not dramatically, but enough. A faint red had climbed her neck and was working its way toward her jaw. Her hands, which had been folded in front of her, had tightened against each other. Mason looked up from the floor, saw the box, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite shame and was, I thought, closer to a man recognizing the bottom of something he had been hoping to avoid looking at. Dorian Whitaker from the dining room doorway said nothing. He just looked at Brielle with the expression of a man updating a file. I reached into the box and ran my finger along the clean white interior just to be certain. Then I looked at Brielle and said quietly, and without any heat at all, "Your sincerity is just like this box." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard in years. Brielle's jaw tightened until I could see the muscle working at the corner of it. Her eyes went bright and hard, the brightness that comes just before a person either cries or decides they are absolutely not going to cry. And she chose the latter with a visible effort that traveled from her chin to her shoulders to her hands. Greg cleared his throat from across the room. It was not a meaningful sound. It was just a man who needed to clear his throat. Clara turned back toward the kitchen and began moving dishes that did not need to be moved. Renee quietly redirected her boys toward the dining table, and Mason stood in the middle of my living room looking at the empty box in my hands, with his chest rising and falling in the uneven rhythm of a man who is holding something in that is getting heavier by the second. His hands came out of his pockets. He pressed one of them briefly against his forehead, the same gesture he had made at the shop 2 days ago, and I watched something shift in him, some interior weight, redistributing itself toward a conclusion he had been moving toward for longer than today. "Brielle," he said, and his voice came out strange, flat, and quiet, in a way I had not heard from him before, not the suppressed frustration I was used to, not the strained placation. Something else, something that sounded like a man who has reached the end of something and knows it. "Can we go outside for a minute?" It was not a question. Brielle looked at him, then at me, then at Dorian in that order, and in that sequence of glances I could see the calculation happening. What to say, how to recover this, what play was still available. Then she looked back at Mason, and something in his face must have told her that the play she was looking for did not exist tonight, because she lifted her chin, turned toward the door, and walked out. Mason followed her. The front door clicked shut behind them. For a moment, the living room breathed the way a room breathes after something is over. Then Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway with a rack of ribs on a serving platter and said in exactly the right tone, "I need someone to clear some space on the dining table. These have been resting long enough." Renee's boys shrieked and scrambled for their seats. Terrence resumed pouring. Greg picked up his bourbon and caught my eye from across the room, and the look he gave me was the look of a man who had been waiting a long time to watch this particular thing happen. I set the empty box down on the entryway table. Then I went to help Pete with the ribs. 30 seconds later, from outside, I heard voices rising. Brielle's first sharp and escalating, then Mason's lower, but not backing down, not the way he usually backed down. The December wind carried fragments through the closed door, "Your fault," and never once, "and I am done," and then nothing, just the wind. I did not go to the window. I had a rack of ribs to serve and 23 people at my table who had shown up because they wanted to, and outside was outside and inside was mine. The front door opened at 9:47. I knew because I had just checked the clock above the stove, the same cracked bottom clock Helen had bought at the yard sale, still keeping perfect time despite the flaw. Mason came in alone. I heard one car door close before he stepped inside. Brielle had driven herself home. The door clicked shut behind him, and I heard in the sudden absence of outside noise that the voices had stopped. Wherever Brielle was, she had not come back with him. He stood in the front hallway for a moment, not moving. From the dining room came the sounds of the party continuing. Greg's laugh, Renee's boys arguing over the last piece of pie, Terrence asking someone if they wanted a refill. The house was full and warm and completely indifferent to the fact that Mason Coulter was standing in the entryway looking like a man who had just walked through something he could not walk back through. His coat was still on. His face was pale in the particular way that faces go pale when they have been outside in the cold and in the middle of something hard. At the same time, not the clean pale of the weather, but the drawn, hollowed pale of a man who has been running on adrenaline for 3 days and has just run out. I came out of the kitchen and stood in the hallway. "Kitchen," I said. One word. He understood. He followed me in, and I pulled the door most of the way closed behind us, leaving a gap so the sounds of the party could still drift through the laughter, the clinking, the ordinary noise of people enjoying themselves, because I wanted him to hear it. I wanted the contrast to be present in the room with us. I went to the counter beside the refrigerator, opened the junk drawer. Every house has a junk drawer, and mine was the third one down on the left, the one Helen had called the everything drawer, because that was more honest, and I took out a folded piece of paper. I had found it 6 weeks ago, tucked inside the pocket of a jacket I had lent Mason 2 winters back, when his had been at the cleaner. He had returned the jacket without checking the pockets, which was either carelessness or, I sometimes thought, something else. I had unfolded it, read it, refolded it, and put it in the everything drawer. I had not known exactly what I was going to do with it. I had known I was going to do something. I smoothed it out on the kitchen table and turned it so Mason could read it. It was Brielle's handwriting, the looping, self-conscious script she used when she was writing something she intended to be seen. A grocery list for the Christmas party. Imported champagne quantity 3 cases. Wagyu beef tenderloin 12 pounds. White truffle oil. Orchid centerpieces 6 arrangements. Sterling silver serving pieces rental. And at the bottom of the page in a different pen, the ink slightly darker, written in a quick, pressured hand that was less careful than the rest. Tell Raymond to pay, he'll sign whatever you put in front of him. Mason read it. I watched his face while he read it. I watched the color that had already been absent drain further until he looked like something essential had been quietly removed from him. His jaw tightened and then released in a way that looked involuntary, like a muscle giving up on a grip it could no longer maintain. His right hand, which had been resting flat on the table, curled slowly inward until his knuckles were white against the wood. "How long have you had this?" he asked. His voice was barely above a conversation. 6 weeks, I said. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he was looking at the paper, not at me. "Dad, I didn't know she wrote that." "I believe you," I said, and I did. That was the thing I genuinely did. Mason had been many things in the last 5 years that I had found difficult. Weak. Avoidant. Unwilling to look directly at what was happening in his own house. But he was not calculating, not in the way this note was calculating, and I had known him for 35 years. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out Helen's letter and the small green notebook. I set them on the table beside the grocery list. "Your mother left these for me," I said. 3 years ago. I opened the letter 2 nights ago." Mason looked at the notebook, and something happened in his face that I was not prepared for. His chin dropped slightly, the way a chin drops when a person is working very hard against something that is trying to come up from below. And his eyes went bright and wet, and he pressed his lips together so hard they went white at the edges. "That's her handwriting," he said, and his voice broke clean in half on the last word. "It is," I said. I read him the relevant parts of the letter. Helen's voice in my own mouth, the humor in the opening line, the clarity of the condition. She had laid out the last paragraph about Alaska, and enough, and taking up space. I read slowly, the way you read something important, and Mason sat across from me at the kitchen table where he had eaten 10,000 meals as a child, and by the time I finished, his eyes were streaming, and he was not trying to stop it anymore, just letting it happen, with the exhausted surrender of a man who has been holding something back for a very long time and has finally irrevocably run out of the capacity to keep doing so. I turned to the last page of the green notebook and read him Helen's final entry. "Ray has given too much. I hope one day he allows himself to receive." Mason pressed both hands over his face. His shoulders shook once, a single convulsive movement that he could not contain. And then he pulled in a breath so ragged it sounded like it hurt, and pressed his hands harder against his eyes, and said from behind his hands, in a voice so wrecked it was barely intelligible, She knew the whole time, and she never said anything to me." "She was protecting you," I said, "the way she always did. She should have told me." His hands came down. His face was completely unguarded in a way I had not seen since he was a small boy. Every defense stripped away, every careful construction of adulthood. Gone just Mason, just my son, 35 years old and undone by his mother's handwriting. I would have listened. I would have... He stopped, swallowed. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe that's the thing I have to live with. I did not argue with him about that because it was possibly true, and he was the one who had to decide what to do with it. His phone buzzed on the table between us. The screen lit up. Brielle, 17, missed calls. He looked at it, his jaw set. He reached out, turned it face down on the table, and left it there. Dad, he said. His voice had steadied, somewhat roughened but present. The fund. Mom's fund. He looked at me directly, his eyes still red, still wet, but open in a way they had not been when he walked in. I lost it, didn't I? It was not quite a question. Yes, I said. He nodded. One single nod, the kind that means I understand and I deserve that, and I don't know what comes next all at the same time. From the dining room, Greg's laugh rose above everything else, big and unself-conscious, and completely genuine, the laugh of a man having exactly the Christmas he wanted to be having. Mason listened to it for a moment, his hands flat on the table, his phone face down between us. Then he said very quietly, "Can I stay tonight?" "Your room's already made up," I said. Mason looked at me across the kitchen table, eyes still red-faced, still stripped down to something honest and unguarded. And he nodded in the slow way of a man who was not quite sure he deserved the thing he had just been offered, but was too exhausted to argue about it. From the dining room, the party was winding down in the gradual, comfortable way that good parties wind down, voices dropping from a crowd to a handful. The clink of glasses becoming occasional rather than constant. Pete and Greg having what sounded like a detailed and passionate disagreement about the best way to store leftover ribs that neither of them needed to be having at 10:30 at night. I stood up from the table and started clearing the mugs. Mason did not move right away. He sat with his hands flat on the table looking at his mother's green notebook, which I had left there between us. "Can I read it?" he asked. "The whole thing." "It's yours to read," I said. He picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something that belonged to someone who is gone, with a particular conscientiousness, as if the object itself is owed a certain quality of attention. He opened it to the first page, and I watched his face as he began to read Helen's careful columns of numbers, her margin notes, her small observations in the spaces between entries. His throat moved. I finished clearing the table and left him to it. I was at the sink rinsing mugs when his phone lit up on the table. The screen faced up, I had not turned it back over. Mason had left it face down himself, but it had been bumped at some point, and now the notifications were visible. A text message, then another, then a third in quick succession, each one making the phone buzz against the wood. Mason saw them. I kept my hands in the sink and did not look at the screen directly. But I heard him exhale a short, sharp breath through his nose, the kind that means a person has just read something that hit them exactly where they expected to be hit, and are angry at themselves for still being surprised by it. She says, he started and then stopped. Started again. She says if I don't come home tonight and figure out a way to fix the money situation by tomorrow, she's going to file for divorce. He said it the way you say something you have heard 100 times and are exhausted by flat and precise, all the shock long since worn off, just the fact of it remaining. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. "Mason," I said, "what do you want to do?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the avoiding kind of quiet I had learned the difference over 35 years. This was the quiet of a man who actually had an answer, and was deciding whether he was ready to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that thinking it had not. He picked up the phone. For a moment, he just held it, screen up, Brielle's messages visible. His thumb moved to the keyboard. I watched him type slowly at first, then with more certainty, the way you write something when you know what you mean, and are done rearranging it. He pressed send. Then he set the phone face down on the table again and left his hand flat on top of it, as if he was making sure it stayed where it was. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said the papers will be ready Monday morning," he said. His voice was quiet and rough and completely steady. That she should reach out to her own attorney. His hand was trembling slightly against the back of the phone. I could see it from where I was standing, the fine, barely visible tremor of a person who has just done something that cannot be undone and whose body has not yet caught up with the decision their mind made. But he did not move the hand. He did not pick the phone back up. The phone buzzed under his palm. Then again. Then a sustained vibration that meant she was calling. Mason looked down at his hand on the phone. He lifted it, accepted the call, and brought the phone to his ear. "Brielle," he said. I could hear her voice through the speaker from across the kitchen. Not the words, just the sound of it, fast and sharp and climbing the way her voice got when she was losing control of a situation and was reaching for any available lever. Mason listened. His jaw was tight. His free hand came up to the table and pressed flat against the surface, knuckles going white, the way they had when he read the grocery list. But different this time, not the white of someone absorbing a blow, but the white of someone holding themselves in place against a current that was trying to move them. She was still talking when he said, "I heard you. I said Monday." She kept talking. "Brielle." His voice was firmer now, and underneath the firmness, there was something I recognized, the tone of a man who is done negotiating, not because he won, but because he has decided the negotiation itself was the problem. "I'm going to hang up now." He ended the call. He sat there for a moment, with the phone in his hand, looking at it, chest rising and falling in the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man making himself breathe evenly when everything in him wants to do something else. Then he set the phone down on the table face down again and looked up at me. His eyes were dry now, still red at the edges, still carrying everything from the last hour, but dry. "I've been afraid of that conversation for 3 years, he said. "I know," I said. "It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be." "It never is," I said. "The waiting is always worse than the thing." He let out a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. From the dining room, I heard Pete say goodnight to Clara, heard the sound of coats being collected, the shuffle of people moving toward the door. The party was finishing the way it had run all evening, without anyone organizing it. Everything happening at the natural pace of people who were comfortable and unhurried. I walked to the doorway and looked out. Greg was helping Renee's boys with their jackets. Terrence was boxing up the leftover desserts with the efficiency that had characterized everything he had done all evening. Dorian was at the front door saying something to Pete that made them both laugh, the easy laugh of two men who have just had a genuinely good night and are not trying to pretend otherwise. I looked at all of it for a moment. Then I went back into the kitchen, where my son was sitting at the table with his mother's notebook and his phone face down, and his hands finally still. "Go say goodnight to your uncle," I said. "Then get some sleep. Room's on the left, same as always. Clean towels in the hall closet." He stood up. He was steadier on his feet than he had been when he walked in 2 hours ago, and there was something different in the way he held himself, not better exactly, not resolved, but upright in a way that was more than just physical. He picked up Helen's green notebook and held it carefully. "Can I keep this tonight?" he asked. You can keep it as long as you need it, I said. He nodded. He walked through the kitchen door toward the dining room, and I heard his voice join the others greeting his uncle, saying goodnight to Renee. The ordinary sounds of a man re-entering a room he had been absent from. I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the backyard. The smoker had gone dark. The snow that had fallen during the day was still on the branches of Helen's oak tree, bright white under the porch light. The phone on the table buzzed one more time. I did not look at it. The last guest left at 11:12. Pete was the final one out the door, the way he usually was. He had stayed to help stack the chairs and wrap the leftover food and wipe down the dining table, doing it with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who considers leaving a kitchen cleaner than he found it a basic point of personal honor. At the door, he shook my hand the way he always did, both hands, and held it a beat longer than usual. "Good Christmas, Ray," he said. "Good Christmas, Pete," I said. He went down the porch steps and I watched his taillights until they turned the corner, and then I closed the door and threw the deadbolt and stood in the hallway in the sudden quiet of a house that had been full of people for 4 hours and was now very completely not. Mason was in the kitchen. I could hear him, the sound of water running, dishes moving, the particular scrape of the good serving platter being set in the dish rack with appropriate care. I had not asked him to do anything. He had simply, at some point while I was saying goodnight to Greg and Renee and Terrence and everyone else, drifted into the kitchen and started cleaning. I took my time in the hallway. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, Helen's hook, the one she had insisted on installing at exactly her height, which meant it had always been slightly too low for me, and I had used it anyway for 30 years. I turned off the porch light. I checked the thermostat. Small, habitual things. The things you do in a house when the house is yours, and you know every inch of it, and there is nowhere else you need to be. When I came into the kitchen, Mason had the water off and was drying his hands on the dish towel, looking around for what to do next. The counters were wiped. The serving dishes were stacked. The table had been cleared, and the chairs pushed back in. He had done all of it while I was saying goodnight. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," he said. He hung the dish towel back on the oven handle and looked around the kitchen with the slightly lost expression of a man who has run out of tasks and is not sure what to do with his hands. "Is there anything else that needs—" "Drawer on the left of the sink," I said. "Extra dish towels if the other one's damp." He opened the drawer. He was looking for dish towels. What he found instead was the stack of Christmas cards. There were 9 of them in their envelopes, each one sealed and addressed in my handwriting. Mason and Brielle, their address. One for each Christmas since Mason had married and moved out. The address on the top one was from 3 years ago, before they moved to the current house, and I had updated it every year in the same deliberate block print I had always used for anything I considered important. Every one of them was sealed. Every one of them was stamped. Every one of them had never been mailed. Mason reached into the drawer slowly, the way you reach for something when your hand has gotten ahead of your brain, and he picked up the stack. He turned them over, looked at the addresses, looked at the stamps, looked at the return address in the upper left corner, R. Coulter, my address, printed neat and certain. He turned them over again and looked at the sealed backs. "Dad," he said. His voice had gone very careful. "Why are these still here?" I leaned against the counter across from him and crossed my arms, not defensively, just to have somewhere to put them. "Every year I wrote them," I said. "Every year I addressed them, stamped them, had them ready to mail." I paused. "And every year I thought, if I send this and Brielle intercepts it before you see it, it ends up in the recycling without you ever knowing it existed. So I kept them." I looked at him steadily. "I was going to give them to you eventually. I just hadn't figured out when eventually was." Mason stood at the open drawer holding 9 years of Christmas cards that had never made it to his mailbox. And I watched the information arrange itself on his face the way information does when it is confirming something a person has been afraid to look at directly. His chin dropped. His throat moved. He pulled out the chair closest to him and sat down at the kitchen table. Not gracefully, not deliberately, just folding into it, the way a person sits when their legs have made a unilateral decision. He set the stack of cards on the table in front of him, with both hands, very gently, the way you set down something that deserves better than it got. He picked up the top one, the most recent this past year, and slid his finger under the sealed flap and opened it. I had written the same thing every year, more or less. Not much. I was not a man who filled Christmas cards with paragraphs. A few lines, something about the year, something about being proud of him, something about Helen in the earlier ones, about how she would have wanted me to say it, even if I wasn't sure how to. The last line was always the same. The door is always open. Dad. Mason read it. His lips moved slightly, the way lips move when someone is reading something. They want to make sure they are getting exactly right. Then he opened the next one, and the next. He read all 9 of them sitting at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night on Christmas Eve, while I stayed where I was against the counter and did not move and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was more important than what was already happening. By the 4th card, his eyes were wet again. By the 6th, he stopped trying to keep them from spilling over, and a tear dropped onto the envelope in his hand, and he pressed his thumb against it, smearing it slightly, and kept reading. By the 9th, the oldest one, the first Christmas after the wedding, 9 years ago, his hand was shaking badly enough that the card rattled slightly, and he had to set it down flat on the table and press his palm over it to keep it still. He sat like that for a moment, palm flat over the oldest card, eyes down, chest working. Then he looked up at me and his face was so completely open, every defense not just down, but gone, dismantled, the whole careful construction of adulthood and distance and managed presentation, simply absent, that for a moment he looked exactly like the 8-year-old who used to hand me wrenches in the garage and ask me why. She never showed me, he said. Did she? It was not a question. I don't know what happened to the ones I mailed in the first couple of years, I said honestly. After that, I stopped mailing them. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright with something that was past tears, now something harder and more directed. Not at me, I could see that clearly, but at the accumulation of small deliberate erasures that added up to what they added up to. Dad. His voice came out rough and low, scraped clean of everything except what he actually meant. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I let this happen, and I told myself it wasn't that bad, and it was that bad, it was exactly that bad, and I'm sorry. I pushed off the counter and walked across the kitchen. I put my hand on his shoulder, my son sitting at the table where he had done homework at age 9 and eaten cereal at age 12 and cried at age 17 when the girl he liked had broken his heart. The same table, the same kitchen, 35 years of this specific person being mine to look out for. I left my hand there. He reached up and covered it with his the way children do when they are very young, and then stop doing, and then sometimes, in the moments that matter most, do again. We stayed like that for a while, my hand on his shoulder, his hand over mine, the kitchen quiet around us, Helen's oak tree visible through the window, with the snow still white on the branches under the porch light. Go to bed, I said finally. Room on the left, same as always. He nodded. He gathered the 9 cards together, carefully tapping them into a neat stack, and held them against his chest as he stood. Can I keep these? He asked. They were always yours, I said. He walked out of the kitchen, I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavier going up than they used to be, the weight of a grown man where a boy used to be, and then the soft click of his old bedroom door. I turned off the kitchen light. I stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the house settle around me, the baseboard heater, the refrigerator hum, the wind outside finding the gaps it always found. Then I went to the window and looked out at Helen's tree. The door is always open. "Good night, Helen," I said. I was awake at 4:53. Not because of anything, not a sound, not a dream, not the particular anxiety that sometimes pulls a person up out of sleep before they are ready. Just the ordinary waking of a body that had been doing this for 40 years and had long since stopped asking permission. 4:53 on Christmas morning, the house completely dark, the only light, the faint blue-gray of pre-dawn coming through the bedroom curtains. I lay there for a moment looking at the ceiling. The house had a different quality in the hour before anyone else was awake. Not emptier, fuller in a way, weighted with everything that had happened in its walls. 31 years of this house. Helen bringing Mason home from the hospital to the room down the hall. Mason learning to walk in the living room, crashing into the coffee table so regularly that we finally moved it against the wall and left it there for 2 years. The Christmas mornings when he was small enough that the sound of him discovering his presence could be heard from the bedroom. The gasp, the scramble, the thudding feet on the stairs. The Christmas mornings after Helen got sick, when we were both very careful to make things feel normal, and neither of us quite managed it. The Christmas mornings after she was gone, when I sat at the kitchen table alone with my coffee, and the house was so quiet that the refrigerator hum felt loud. I got up. I put on my robe and my slippers, the ones Helen had given me 2 Christmases before she passed, dark green fleece slightly too big, because she always bought things a size up, so they would last, a habit she had developed during the years when money was tight and never fully let go of, even when it wasn't. I went downstairs, carefully, one hand on the banister, because the 3rd step from the top had always creaked, and I did not want to wake Mason. The 3rd step creaked anyway. It always had. In the kitchen, I filled the percolator and set it on the stove and stood at the window while it heated, looking out at the backyard in the dark. Helen's oak tree was a shape against the pre-dawn sky. The snow still on the upper branches, the lower ones bare where the wind had cleared them during the night. The smoker Pete and I had run all day was a dark shape on the back porch, cold now, its work done. I thought about the last 3 days, not in the way you think about something when you are trying to process it, not analytically, not with any attempt to arrange it into a narrative that made clean sense. More the way you think about weather after it has passed. It happened. It was real. The ground is changed by it, and now you figure out what that means going forward. I had canceled a party that was never mine to throw. I had taken back tires and a key and a monthly check and 2 years of my garage space. I had listened to a voicemail that told me what someone thought of me when they did not know I was listening. I had read my wife's letter after 3 years of not being ready. I had watched my son cry over 9 Christmas cards he had never known existed. None of it had felt the way I expected it to feel when I imagined it, and I had imagined it in the abstract, in the quiet moments over the past year when I let myself look directly at what was happening. I had expected to feel righteous or relieved or vindicated. I had expected some clean, clear emotion that announced itself and stayed put. What I felt instead was something quieter and less defined than any of those things. A kind of tiredness that was not unpleasant, the tiredness of a job that had needed doing for a long time and had now been done. And underneath that, something that I recognized only slowly, the way you recognize a smell that has been absent for so long, you forgot it was once ordinary. Peace. Just ordinary peace standing in my kitchen at 5 in the morning, in my dead wife's 2 big slippers, watching the percolator and listening to the house breathe. The percolator began its first cycle, a low, comfortable sound that Helen had always said was her favorite noise in the world, better than music, she said, because it always meant something good was coming. I poured the first cup and held it in both hands. The morning paper was not something I read anymore. I had let the subscription lapse 2 years ago, when I realized I was only reading the obituaries and the weather, neither of which required a subscription. But the habit of standing at the kitchen window with the first cup of the day was still there, had always been there, and I stood in it now and let the coffee warm my hands and looked out at the gray shape of the yard, becoming gradually less gray as the sky began its slow climb from dark to light. I thought about Helen's letter. Go to Alaska. You've given enough. Alaska in the spring. I had looked it up once years ago when Helen and I had talked about it vaguely, the way couples talk about things they mean to do eventually. Denali, the coastline. The particular quality of light in May that photographers went there for the way it stayed low on the horizon all day and made everything look like a painting. Helen had wanted to see the glaciers before they were gone. She had not made it. I could make it. The thought settled into me the way good thoughts settle, not with fanfare, not with the rush of sudden decision, but with the quiet certainty of something that has been true for a while and has finally been given permission to be acknowledged. I was going to Alaska in the spring. I was going to go alone, which I had spent years thinking would be a sad thing, and now understood was not a sad thing. I was going to see the glaciers and the light and the coastline, and I was going to take Helen's green notebook with me and write something in the last few blank pages at the back, because she had left them blank, and it seemed to me now that she had done that on purpose. I heard the third step creak. Mason's footsteps came down the stairs with the particular careful weight of someone trying not to disturb a quiet house, which meant he had been awake long enough to be deliberate about it. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in the old University of Michigan sweatshirt he had left in his closet 11 years ago, which fit him differently now across the shoulders, but was still unmistakably the same sweatshirt. He looked at me standing at the window with my coffee. "You're already up," he said. "I'm always already up," I said. He came to the counter and I handed him a mug, without being asked, the heavy ceramic one with the uneven handle, Helen's favorite from the craft fair, the one I always used myself but gave to him now without thinking about it. He poured his coffee and came to stand beside me at the window. We stood there together looking out at the backyard. The sky had shifted from gray to the particular pale gold that comes just before the sun clears the horizon, and Helen's oak tree was coming into definition against it, the snow on the upper branches catching the first light and going briefly, brilliantly white. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Mason said. His voice was quiet and rough around the edges, the voice of a man who had not slept much and was not pretending otherwise, but there was something solid in it that had not been there 3 days ago, something that had found its footing. "Merry Christmas, son," I said. We drank our coffee. Outside, the sun came up over the roofline of the house across the street, and the backyard filled with the low golden light of a clear December morning. And Helen's tree stood in it the way it had stood in every kind of light for 35 years, bare and patient, and entirely itself the way things are when they have been exactly where they belong for long enough to stop wondering about it. At some point, we moved to the living room. Not by plan, Mason picked up his coffee and drifted toward the couch, and I followed, and we settled on opposite ends of it, the way we always had when he was a teenager. And we used to watch the early bowl games on New Year's morning, him at one end, with his feet tucked under him, me at the other, with mine on the floor, the two of us perfectly comfortable in a silence that had never needed filling. The fire had gone down to coals overnight. I added 2 logs and got it going again, and the light shifted in the room warmer orange-edged, the particular quality of firelight that makes everything look like it has been there forever. Mason had Helen's green notebook in his lap. He was not reading it, just holding it one hand flat on the cover. "Tell me about Alaska," he said. "Gosh." So I told him. The glaciers. Denali in May when the light stays low all day and everything looks like the world is showing off. The coastline. The idea of sitting somewhere genuinely far from anywhere and drinking coffee that tasted like it meant something because it was cold enough outside that warmth was an event rather than a default. Mason listened the way he had listened as a boy, fully without interrupting, his coffee mug held in both hands and his eyes on the fire. "Mom would have loved that," he said when I finished. "She would have complained about the cold the entire time and loved every minute of it," I said. He laughed, a short, genuine sound that came out before he could decide whether it was appropriate, the kind of laugh that grief produces sometimes when a memory lands exactly right. It was the best sound I had heard in 3 days. We sat with that for a moment. "I'm going to figure things out," he said. Not to me exactly, more to the fire, to the room, to whatever version of himself was listening. "The apartment, the money, all of it. I'm not going to ask you for anything." "I know," I said. "I mean it." "I know you do," I said. "And Mason, if there's ever something you actually need, not something she wants, something you actually need, the door is open. That hasn't changed." He looked at me then, and his face did something complicated and honest that I did not try to interpret, just let be what it was. "Okay," he said quietly. I looked at the fire. Outside the living room window, the street was still and white and completely unhurried, the way streets are on Christmas morning, before the world remembers it has somewhere to be. I had spent 5 years making myself smaller, so that other people could feel more comfortable in the space I vacated. I had written checks and signed invoices and swallowed words, and told myself it was generosity, when a good portion of it was fear of being difficult, fear of being unwanted, fear that if I stopped being useful, I would stop being necessary. What I understood now, sitting in my own living room on Christmas morning, with my son beside me and my wife's notebook between us, and a fire I had built myself, throwing light across the walls, was that I had confused the two things for a very long time. Being needed is not the same as being loved. Being useful is not the same as belonging. The people who had filled this house last night, Greg with his bourbon, and Renee with her boys, and Pete with his ribs, and Clara with her apron, she always brought herself. They had not come because I had organized them, fed them, funded them. They had come because they wanted to be where I was, not what I could provide. Where I was, that was the thing Helen had been trying to tell me for years, in the way she told me things sideways, gently, with patience, waiting for me to be ready to hear it. I picked up my coffee. The mug was still warm. "I'm going to book the trip today," I said. "Alaska, May." Mason looked over at me and smiled, a real one, unhurried, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Good," he said. "Take a lot of pictures." "I'll try," I said. We sat there until the fire settled into a steady burn, and the street outside got its first car of the morning, and the coffee got cold in our mugs, without either of us particularly caring. It was, all things considered, the best Christmas I'd had in years. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't, not fully, not yet. Mason had hard months ahead of him. I had phone calls I had not returned, and conversations still to have, and a dining table I still intended to sell to a consignment shop sometime in January. But the weight was gone. The particular specific weight of a man who has been carrying something that was never his to carry, set down at last in his own house on his own terms, on a morning that belonged entirely to him. I reached over and picked up Helen's green notebook from Mason's lap. I turned to the last page, the one with her final entry, the uneven handwriting of her last months, and below it, in the blank space she had left at the bottom of the page, I wrote 4 words in my own hand. Alaska. May. Thank you. I closed the notebook. Outside, the sun was fully up now, filling the street with the clean, uncomplicated light beat of a winter morning that had decided to be beautiful without asking anyone's permission. I have thought about how to say this, and I will say it simply. I believe God puts certain moments in front of us, not to break us, but to show us what we have been afraid to see. That phone call from Brielle was mine. Here is what I want to say to anyone who recognizes themselves in this story. Do not wait as long as I did. If someone treats your generosity as a given and your presence as optional, stop. Quietly, completely. Let your actions say what your words never could. I confused being needed with being loved for 5 years. That is 5 years I will not get back. In so many family justice stories, the pattern is the same. A parent funds a life they are not welcome, and a child forgets where they came from. These revenge stories family members recognize all too well are not rare. They are everywhere, and the lesson keeps needing to be learned because we keep being afraid to teach it. The people who show up when you stop performing those are your people. If this story reached you somewhere true, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe if you haven't. More stories are coming. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. The stories on this channel include fictional elements built for reflection and education. If this content is not right for you, we understand completely, and we wish you well.